Streaming live via the internet, welcome to ISP Radio, your weekly source for ISP-related news, events, and interviews with industry experts. If you deliver internet via fiber optic, fixed wireless, coax, or any other way, you're in the right place. And now a brief word from our sponsors. Link Technologies Incorporated provides the lowest priced Microtech products in North America, as well as Wade Towers, Mimosa, Cambium, Ubiquity, Nettonics, and a host of other products and services to be your one-stop shop for your ISP needs. Visit www.linktechs.net. That's LINKTECHS.net for more information. TowerCoverage.com, providing online RF coverage maps with website integration. Stop rolling your trucks for every site survey and start doing installations. Visit www.towercoverage.com now. And now we'd like to present our hosts, Steve Grabiel and Dennis Burgess.
Welcome to another edition of ISP Radio. I'm your host, Steve Grabiel, broadcasting our show from Moriarty, New Mexico. Actually not broadcasting, but participating in the broadcast of the show. And Dennis Burgess is actually broadcasting the show and co-hosting the show from St. Louis, Missouri. Dennis, you there?
I am here.
Well, good. Well, we had a show yesterday that was, I found pretty good. What did you think?
We'll have to see. It's always the proof is in the quality of the product and stuff like that, but it does look very promising. We're gonna probably take a look at it, see if it beats our existing CRM system. So I think we're probably going to use it as a CRM, or at least attempt to anyway. Maybe use some of his consulting services. You never know, but definitely looks really good. We got a really good response out of Facebook, all that kind of good stuff. So thank you very much for that as well. Yeah.
Well, beautiful day out here. It was blowing and nasty and cold yesterday. Now it's going to be in the mid-70s. We are going from 50s high to mid-70s.
Yeah. We ended up having some absolutely horrible and nasty storms come through St. Louis last night about 6, 7 o'clock. We actually had the baseball game got canceled. They rescheduled that and such. But overall, and on a positive note, me being a native St. Louisan, etc. Go Blues! We are going to be playing in the Stanley Cup, so that's really good. Ended up watching that along with watching the weather yesterday. Lots of people down there, lots of people downtown, and it did not look nice yesterday. But again, it definitely happens and such. So. Those types of things definitely happen, if that makes sense. So,
yeah, no flooding, right?
The answer is not really. It will come down the river, in the rivers. I should rephrase that. So, we're not out of the woods yet. Nothing for my area as far as flash flooding. It may have, but I go through a low water bridge to get out of my house, and that bridge, it may have flash flooded, but I was not there, and usually it's maybe 20, 30 minutes and it's back down, so it's not really a big deal, if that makes sense. But we did have a tornado, a confirmed tornado in St. Louis County. It was not in the county, it was actually in St. Charles County and such, and some trees and such blown down. Not really too terribly much. Airport was shut down for a while due to the storms coming through, but that's about it. I mean, they said that it was going to be not a great evening. Obviously the Cardinals game is being held at the Busch Stadium, which is open. Obviously that got rained out. They didn't even have the game, but otherwise, good night for St. Louis.
Yeah. Well, on today's show, we have someone that's not a stranger to the show, Steve Coran, the WISPA attorney. And Steve was gracious enough to come on the show to tell us about what's going on with his pursuits in Washington for the industry. And Steve, you there?
I am here. Hi, Steve. Hi, Dennis.
Hi. What's the weather like out in D.C.?
I think it's like 75 degrees and sort of partly sunny, and it's getting warmer over the weekend. We may hit 90 for the holiday. So
Wow.
That's nice.
yeah,
That's really
and
nice.
we've got our own baseball team here that is not doing so well, but still maybe heading out to see a game over the weekend. So and go Blues.
Yeah, we actually always try to go about once a year to a baseball game. We usually get win some tickets or we bid on some tickets and such. This will be my first year that I'm gonna take my 4-year-old to a game. So
Oh boy.
that ought to be interesting. So
Yeah,
Oh well,
I try to get to the Isotopes once a month.
there you go. There you go.
So Steve, take it away.
all right. Well, thanks, guys, and always a pleasure to join you every 3 or 4 months and provide an update and get the word about what WISPA is working on out to your listeners and viewers. Let me kind of, I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 things today, and the first one, what I'm going to talk about is sort of the 4 S's. So let's talk about Spectrum. Let's talk about Sprint and T-Mobile and what's new with their merger. Talk a little bit about subsidies and a subset of that, broadband mapping, and then also a little bit about small businesses. So hopefully we'll be able to get through the entire agenda here, but a lot to cover. So let me kind of get going and talk first about what's going on in Spectrum. And the first band I'm going to talk about is the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, otherwise known as CBRS. This is the band that most folks know covers 3550 to 3700, so it's 150 megahertz of spectrum with a lot of development on the LTE side. The top 50 megahertz of that, 3650 to 3700, is a band that a lot of fixed wireless operators and communities and colleges and oil companies have used for broadband. For broadband. So that band is going to get rolled into this new CBRS band pretty soon. So a couple things are happening, some good, some maybe not so good in the very near future. Good thing is we've seen the spectrum access system and the environmental sensing capability development advance pretty far, and there are operators who are approved by the FCC to provide those types of spectrum management services. The Spectrum Access System, or SAS, regulates the various tiers of use: incumbent use, priority access licensing, which is sort of like exclusive licensing, and then general authorized access, which is licensed by rule or something along the lines of unlicensed, but there's a registration requirement before you can fire up. The ESC is sensing capability that's deployed around military installations and, more importantly, along the coast to prevent the military from experiencing any interference. So a couple of companies are approved by the FCC. It's been a long haul to get there, to build the algorithms and the practices and the protocols to have these giant Borgs, if you will, manage spectrum and manage interference zones. So that's a positive development. The next development that we're going to see is the FCC authorizing something called Initial Commercial Deployments, or ICDs. ICDs is essentially a pretty extensive field trial to make sure that the equipment can sync up with the SAS and the ESC so that everything is working right. So obviously think about this as practice runs at the Indianapolis Speedway, or trial runs for anything that's kind of new, kind of the beta test, if you will. So a couple of issues have come up with that. One is that for the WISP-type deployments that would require higher power antennas at the customer premise, that equipment hasn't been approved yet because it's essentially treated, these devices are essentially treated as access points because of their power level, and therefore there needs to be some process before they can fire up and sync up with the associated access point. So the equipment for that, as I said, is not certified yet and can't be certified until there's sort of this process that takes place. So it's probably going to be September, maybe later, maybe a little earlier, before we see the type of higher power consumer premise equipment that WISPs are going to require at the customer end. So the question here is, how do we move forward with these initial commercial deployments that many wireless ISPs will be participating in if the equipment is not certified? So WISPA has been working on that at the FCC to try to get some relief there. Been making the rounds with all the commissioners' offices and with the staff, and have another meeting later this week to go over that.
I got a question. Will each CPE be registered in the SAS?
So if it is a higher powered CBSD, meaning it's above 23 dBm per 10 megahertz, the answer is yes, because it's essentially treated like a category B CBSD, which is a citizens band service device. So it's essentially treated for regulatory purposes as if it were an access point, and access points must communicate with the SAS. So when you have an access point and a CPE both communicating with a SAS, they need to be able to communicate with each other as well. So it took a while to develop this, what's called a handshake process, to enable that to happen. The unfortunate thing is it took the FCC quite a while to put that out and to approve it, because it has to go through processes involving NTIA and the Department of Defense for it to be approved. And what happened was it kind of backed up into this ICD process that we expect to happen. And it would have been great if we had this equipment issue behind us, but right now we're sort of they're coming pretty close in time, it looks like. So the ask that we've made is to allow non-certified or uncertified equipment to be used for purposes of the ICD, so long as it's operating under the control of a SAS. So we'll see how that plays out. The FCC is working on it. Just don't have anything further at the moment. But good question. So one of the other things that people ask about is this waiver request that WISPA put in along with the Utilities Technology Council, UTC, back in October. And this was designed to extend the 5-year construction period transition period from Part 90 to Part 96, which expires in 11 months, next April 17th. So the idea here is, first of all, with respect to the matter I just talked about, which is this delay in developing the equipment and building up the supply chain and scheduling crews, tower climbers, equipment changeouts for those that need to do hardware upgrades, going through a certified professional installation process. That's going to take some time, and we all know what happens when it turns to September in Minnesota. It gets really cold and folks can't climb towers, or at least are smart enough not to want to. So where we are on that is that, together with a survey that WISPA did that showed that 70% of the respondents would have to make some kind of hardware change out in order to comply with the new rules. We've submitted that information at the FCC to try to get more time for this transition period beyond April of 2020. So, Blythe, we're going to
Sorry about that.
Continuing to meet with folks at the FCC who have the pen and do have something set up for later this week to hopefully socialize that a little bit more. Don't expect an answer right away, but we know that folks are continuing to work on that at the FCC and hoping that we can get blanket waiver relief for our members. So a recent filing by AT&T last week asked the FCC to establish a new classification of antennas, base station antennas or access point antennas. And what they've asked for is 62 dBm per 10 megahertz, which far exceeds the 47 dBm that is currently permitted. So this is a significant power increase. The FCC has refused on 2 occasions to increase the power. WISPA will probably be, having something to say about, asked and answered. We don't need to create something that's going to require a whole change in the SAS environment and could blow out a lot of the opportunistic use of GAA spectrum in the band. So something else we're working on. Finally, people want to know, when is GAA going to be open? When can I commercialize the service? And when are we going to have the auctions? So I'll answer the question that I know both of you were just dying to ask. We should have GAA sometime later this year. We have to get past the ICD process. So if you ask me to pick a month, I would say October. If you ask me to say when are we going to have PAL auctions, I would say probably about this time next year. The FCC has a bunch of other auctions teed up and doesn't like to schedule auctions at the same time for different spectrum bands. Couple of complicating factors there are, one, the FCC is moving its headquarters sometime next year, so I believe the servers are off-site, but they may be hesitant to conduct an auction while they're moving across town. The second thing is, if things slip into the fall too much, then we're well into an election year, and the question would be whether the FCC wants to move this forward or whether it would get kind of deferred, and especially if there's regime change, that could delay things by a long time, like a year or so, because when new folks come in, they typically like to let things sit and percolate for 3 to 6 months, just so they can get a handle on things before they kind of bite off anything like a big spectrum auction. So that's the latest, good news, bad news, and just general interest news of what's happening in CBRS. So maybe you guys got a couple more questions on that.
Well,
In your personal opinion, will the big guys buy up all the PALs?
So let's talk about that when we talk about the Sprint T-Mobile merger, because I think there's a relationship there. So
Okay.
very good question, but let's bounce through the spectrum stuff, and I'll be sure to talk about that when we talk about the merger. So
Okay.
Good question. Remind me if I forget.
yeah,
Okay.
my take is we still have the GAA, and for most operators, not every operator, but most operators, we're still going to get some spectrum that we can use in what we call license light or the GAA spectrum. So especially these operators that are literally in the middle of nowhere, that are not servicing any type of major city, anything like that. I definitely think that there's probably going to be both the GAA and some of the PAL spectrum that they can operate on in those particular areas. And is it a win for WISPs in general? I think so far it is. I wish that the county size, I think that could be a little smaller, but how many people out there, the majority of WISPs are small, and they're not going to have the money to spend even on really small PALs. So I really think that the county is acceptable, if that makes sense. But then again, if you are servicing a major metropolitan area, that is where you're going to have major major issues. Yeah, there you go. I think you're going to have to fight with those guys in such, and you're not really going to have to fight with them. You're just going to have to fight with them out of the GAA band. The last thing I still haven't seen, and this is it could be already corrected, but what happens when the GAA band is used in an area? The last I heard is it's really up to the spectrum, the SAS provider, to say, well, this channel is the least one that's going to be interfering with other operators, so guess what? You're going to get that. Or are they going to simply say, oh, no, sorry, there is no more channels available, you cannot operate? And that would really, if you've been operating since the inception of CBRS, and then 2 years down the road you have a tower that gets struck by lightning, and you're offline for, let's say, 24 to 48 hours because you have to get new equipment, everything comes in, you have to arrange a tower crew to get up there, maybe there's more weather that comes through, then you put it back up there, and now all of a sudden you can't get a license to operate. That would be really bad in many cases. So I don't know I don't believe the rules actually dictate what they actually have to say. But can you speak to that, Steve?
Well, let me kind of take, you had a couple of things in there I wanted to talk about. So the first thing is countywide PALs. And, WISPA fought long and hard to try to preserve census blocks as the geographic unit for bidding, and we were successful in preventing them from being any larger than counties, because the mobile companies, a lot of other folks wanted, well, actually only the mobile companies wanted much larger areas. So we're at 3,200 counties as opposed to 416 PEAs and 74,000 census blocks. So did pretty well there. But there are folks that there are things that folks can do in order to bid for counties if counties are too big. One is to form a consortium. Another is to lease. If get together with folks and arrange before the auction to, hey, you be the bidder and I will lease out a portion of this county from you. And then there's management agreements and things like that folks can do. So there are ways to work with counties aside from just sort of accepting it as a binary choice. Do I bid for the county on my own or do I not? Getting together with your neighbors, having lease arrangements, sale arrangements, things like that are certainly things that are in play and will be permissible. So that's number one. The second thing is, of course, anytime you're using GAA spectrum, there's always the risk that at some point 70 megahertz of that initial 150 megahertz is going to be auctioned off. You may have all that 70 megahertz of PALs auctioned in every area. You may only have 30 or 40 megahertz or something less than that. But you're always going to have at least 80 megahertz of PALs of GAA spectrum. So and then you have opportunistic use where the PAL is not being used. So for some, that will be an acceptable risk, and for others, it will not be an acceptable risk. And each person is going to have to decide in their own environment, what they prefer to do, what their tolerance for risk is, and do their best to assess it on an individual location basis. Your question.
A question.
So I guess
this might tie into the small business component, which you wanted to talk about. Will they give any deference to small business, and will they allow people to buy these PALs and squat on them and not use them?
So two questions. There's two answers. One is yes, there are bidding credits up to 25% if you can demonstrate that you have your gross revenues on average for the last 3 years was, I may get the number wrong, was $20 million or less. So presumably that would include a lot of the smaller WISPA members, and you would be entitled to a 25% bidding credit. There's a lot of paperwork you have to give the FCC to demonstrate that you qualify for that bidding credit. There's also a 15% bidding credit if you're a rural broadband provider serving 250,000 folks or less. That's every one of WISPA's members. That should be an easier showing, kind of a check the box or look at my Form 477 and qualify. The answer to that question is no, you cannot stack these. So you either get the 25% or the 15% bidding credit. And yes, there are build-out rules. So, and I can't remember exactly what those are, but they involve serving a percentage of the population within the 10-year license term.
Yeah. Now,
Okay.
I guess let me go back to my question is, was there anything done to prevent a operator to, again, they were running for 2 years, they're offline 48 hours, and now somebody else has activated something, just so happens, and now there's no more channels available, or there's no more frequency space available. Is that still up to the SAS operator? Or
Yep, and remember the GAA is at the bottom of the triangle, so the PAL is going to have preference. So it could knock you, if you're using GAA and it's a crowded environment, you may get knocked off, or you may get reduced from 10 megahertz channel down to something smaller than that to allow everybody to share. But there's no first in right that goes to GAA, and you're subject to, you could also get knocked out if you're near the coast and the Navy decides to send a boat in the area and you have to vacate frequencies for several hours. So these are the sorts of things that were built into the rules, and it's kind of an interesting approach. It's designed for innovation, and we'll see if this is the sort of thing that again, that is an acceptable risk for members or not.
And back to my second part of my question, are the big guys going to be able to buy all the PALs and squat on them and not use them?
Well, there are these build out requirements. So the answer is yes, they have build out requirements, but they also are subject to use it or share it. So if they're using the PAL only in a portion of the band or a portion of the geographic area, then anybody else can come in and use the rest of their PAL on a GAA basis, opportunistically, when and where that PAL user is not using the spectrum.
And that's all determined by the SAS?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so they come in and they fire up a AP on their PAL. Their PAL says, "Hey, I have a PAL. Here's all my information," and then they basically they will either occupy a PAL channel or a PAL frequency if one is available, or if none is available, they will apparently bump a GAA user because you were using the PAL spectrum, and now you're going to be hopefully, and that's kind of my big problem is hopefully you would get another channel.
Right.
Hopefully, normally I would think the GAA users would be assigned out of the GAA band first, and not the PAL band. But then again, the big question is, if you are assigned in the PAL band, are you going to be notified of that, or will you be told that to say, hey, there's no more GAA channels left, you're being assigned a PAL channel, assuming that there is no, obviously there's no PAL users currently, but anybody at any time can come in there if they have purchased that and bump you off, and then are you operating or not? That's the big question, and I haven't got any answers from any of the SAS providers to let us know. They basically said both ways. They could go, there's no channels available to give you, therefore you're not going to operate. Or two, they're going to give you the channel with the least amount of interference inside that area, which is kind of a hard thing to do. But now you're stacking. Now you're basically at part 15, we're basically sharing the band with other users and the same frequency space. So again, it's a difficult business proposition whenever you know that you could basically be bumped just by someone coming in and turning on equipment, and now all of a sudden you're not operating.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, it's important to understand there isn't a specific set aside PAL band and GAA band. These are dynamically assigned. So the 10 megahertz channel you start off on may be a different one than you are on a month later or a year later, depending on who else occupies what band. The other thing which you touched on is also kind of interesting, and that is that the basic role of the SAS is to find an available channel. Some SASs will tell you what the best channel is, and it's important to understand that not all SASs are the same. So I encourage folks out there to do their due diligence, do their homework, and ask the right questions of the SAS operators to, figure out what kind of features they may have built into their SAS, what their pricing is, and so forth, because they're not all the same, and that's an important thing to understand.
This could be an opportunistic thing for manufacturers building dual band, 5 gigs, so that you got a 5 gig AP and your 3.6 gear jammed together, kind of like what we're seeing in the 60 and 80 megahertz bands, and then having a client radio with the same thing, that if you do get kicked off because of no channel availability, at least you're not down.
Well, maybe we should, I think that's a great idea, and it wouldn't surprise me to hear that some of the manufacturers out there are not thinking about doing the exact same thing.
Right.
Yeah. They are, and the big problem is you don't get the same coverage with 5 gigahertz as you do with 365.
True.
So, that's going to be a whole nother issue inside there. It's kind of the same thing with 60 gigahertz versus 5 gigahertz. 60 gigahertz, you get a lot of bandwidth. 5 gigahertz, you don't get a whole lot of bandwidth. So, you do have some type of trade-off inside there that you have to be aware of.
Right.
Well, I think I'm out of questions at this point in time. But Steve, if you want to continue on with the, I guess the Sprint stuff.
Well, no, I have more Spectrum stuff to
Oh,
talk
okay,
about, but
gotcha.
you guys keep wanting me to talk about Sprint, so let's talk about Sprint.
There you go.
Yesterday, news broke that Sprint and T-Mobile had submitted uh, a document to the FCC with kind of a long list of commitments they were willing to make in connection with their merger. Um, what they've committed to do is to let me look at my cheat sheet here a little bit. Is to within 3 years of closing on their merger, to provide low band 5G coverage to at least 97% of the U.S. population and mid band 5G coverage of at least 75% of the U.S. population. The low band is the T-Mobile 600 megahertz stuff that they acquired pursuant to the broadcast incentive auction. I want to say that was 2 years ago. And the mid band is going to be the 2.5 that Sprint uses, or at least that's what they're saying. And then within 6 years, they're going to cover low band 5G. Will cover at least 99% of the U.S. population, and mid-band coverage to at least 88% of the U.S. population. That's within 6 years. That's nationwide. Rural areas, at least 85% low band in 3 years, and 55% in with mid band within 3 years, and then within 6 years, 90% of the rural population with low band, and 2/3 of the rural population with mid-band 5G. Probably more interesting and relevant to the fixed operators is what they've committed to do with what they call in-home broadband. So within 3 years, they would market their in-home broadband service to at least 9.6 million eligible households, of which at least 2.6 million are rural households. And then within 6 years, market their in-home broadband service to at least 28 million eligible households, of which 5.6 million are rural. They've also committed to having substantial oversight and verification, and they've agreed to make substantial voluntary contributions if they miss their build out, up to a maximum amount if they miss it by 50% of $250 million. So what's come out of this is the three Republican FCC commissioners have said, yeah, we kind of like this and we're ready to approve. The Democratic ones have said, we're not so sure these are enforceable and they don't seem to be strong enough, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the question is, what's the Department of Justice going to do? And there's a couple of theories running around out there. I'll give you three of them, and I couldn't tell you which one is right. One is that, I think one thing we can take for a given is that there was communication between the chairman's office and the Department of Justice. So one thing that may have happened is the discussion went along with like this, that the FCC said, hey, we're going to go ahead and approve this, and DOJ said, fine, we'll be right behind you. We have a different standard, but we think that we should allow this to go forward, and we like your conditions, or we may have a few others. And so that's one theory. Another theory is that DOJ is rumored to be opposed to this, at least their career staff is, if not the folks who actually run the show at DOJ, and that they may seek to block this, which means that the FCC chairman has said, well, I'm trying to do what I can for 5G, and we've agreed to these conditions, and we understand that, DOJ has a different view on things, but, don't blame me. And the third thing is that the FCC would not have gone ahead with this acceptance of the merger conditions unless it had sign off from the White House that they were not going to block it. So I don't know which one of those scenarios will ultimately prove to be true. We'll just have to kind of wait and see. But that's sort of the state of affairs with the Sprint T-Mobile merger.
Well, I got something to throw out there.
Throw away.
Back about 6-8 years ago, when we had a Democratic president, all innovation in the cellular world stopped. pretty much. There was no innovation going forward. Tower climbers were unemployed and all that stuff. It's interesting that they're saying in 6 years we'll have hit this mark, hit that mark. Well, it all depends on what the economy does. If there's a change in regime and we go back to no innovation in anything, they'll never hit that mark because there's no incentive to do it other than paying out $250 million penalty.
Yeah, and to me, that's, I'm not going to say it's chump change, but to me, in that big of a company, it's probably that penalty is, a line item budget that they can budget over the next, 3 or 5 years, and they'll have that saved up easily enough, and it's not a big deal. It's
But
basically
it also may be substantially less than what it would cost them to build out. So would you
right.
rather spend $10 billion? I'm picking a number out of the air here. $10 billion, hitting that last 5% or that last 50%, or would you rather, say we can't do this, FCC?
Here's your 250 million. Yeah.
Right.
Here's our voluntary contribution.
Right. Right.
We met the intent of it, even though the economy's in the toilet.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of things that could affect build out, whether it's the economy, whether it's, a whole, how do you measure this?
And this is all 5G technology where small cells are going to be going up everywhere, correct?
Well, not so much in 600 megahertz and 2.5 because those are sort of, wider area propagating.
Right.
So, urban areas that may be, more capacity, in rural areas it's more about coverage. So, and they're talking about, 100 meg down speeds over time. So that's what we're looking at. The question becomes, does this pose a threat to some of our WISPA members now that they've made this commitment in order to get their merger done? So are we, as, a lot of privately funded WISP, more or less funding their merger commitment by, by saying, well, we're going to let these guys overbuild you. We don't care what you're doing, little WISP in the middle of nowhere, but if Sprint says they can do it and as part of the merger, then, we're going to hold them to that commitment. So I think there are some things along the margins that could be done to try to, make sure this doesn't become, quite the overbuild that it could be.
What's WISPA's position on what's going on?
So we've had some discussion, but I don't really want to, go public with anything that isn't on record yet. But couple of things we're thinking about doing, and we may be socializing those fairly soon. So it's still sort of under discussion, is what I would say. But
too early to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely had some discussion about it, and we're involved in what's going on. I just, until we've kind of made a decision, I don't really think it's appropriate for me to put it out there as to what we're going to do, because I really don't.
Not a problem.
Yeah, and I think something else on that that lines is the big key word that you said, Steve, is the population covered. They're not trying to cover the entire U.S. They're trying to cover the majority of the population, which is not necessarily everywhere.
East Coast, West Coast.
Right. I mean, I forgot what the percentage is, but I guarantee you it's a lot smaller than you think whenever you actually build it out into a mapping system and actually look at the population and say, hey, here's 95% of the population are in these areas. So
yeah, and they're saying no installation fees and they're going to price it low, but one of the things that they've said is this is going to be a broadband in a box. So it would be a self-install. You'd write in over their website, and they would ship you the device, and you hook it up yourself. And that's kind of a new model that a lot of WISP don't use because these are often custom installations. So that's something else that I'll be very curious to see if they can pull that off, both from a execution standpoint as well as from a is this something that the rural market is willing to accept, or do they would rather have the personal touch of someone coming out and to their home and hooking it up. So
definitely possible at 600 megahertz, not so much. Well, kind of very, very close in 2.5, within a few miles, but at 10 miles, it's not going to be an indoor install at 2.5, even at high power.
Well, I didn't say indoor. I said self-install. So,
Self-install, yeah.
I don't know what that involves. Maybe the 600 megahertz product, you're right, would be the kind of thing that they could put inside the house,
Yeah.
without too much difficulty. But the 2.5 product might be a little more challenging.
For sure.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. Well.
So the next of the S?
Yeah.
So, talk a little bit more about some spectrum things that are coming down the road here. The 2.5 band, I know WISP has been involved in trying to get some rules. We think there's going to be a report and order at the FCC's July meeting, which I think is on July 10th. And this will sort of set the stage for potentially auctions for EBS white space, which is the educational spectrum that is unassigned to anybody at the moment. A lot of places out west of the Mississippi don't currently have EBS, or don't currently have all 5 EBS licenses authorized. So this would be an opportunity for folks to potentially bid on that. Changes underway to also kind of remove some of the educational requirements, remove leasing restrictions, allow educators to sell their licenses to commercial entities. So, and also there will be a certain spot for tribal entities as well. So we're working on some things there to try to get good auction rules and so forth for WISPA members that may want to acquire 2.5 spectrum. So latest intel is that's going to be on the July FCC meeting agenda to adopt rules that the FCC proposed about a year ago. Similarly, the 5.9 band, this is 75 megahertz between 5850 and 5925. We're looking to get a further notice of proposed rulemaking with lots of questions in it, also at the July meeting. The cable guys really want this band for additional Wi-Fi. It's currently licensed to something called dedicated short-range communications for vehicle communications. So the Department of Transportation is interested, as well as a lot of the car manufacturers, in either keeping that for DSRC or having something called CV2X, which is cellular V2X, kind of like a LTE product in the band for that whole 75 megahertz. I would like to think that the FCC is going to find a way to allow that band to be shared, either by splitting the band or having some sort of sharing within the band of various Wi-Fi type unlicensed approach, along with some licensed approach. Hopefully that licensed approach won't be a single technology, because when the FCC says this particular band is for this particular technology and this particular use case, there isn't a whole lot of innovation that takes place, and that's why this band for the last 20 years has been underutilized, and why folks have kind of targeted it for additional unlicensed use. 2 other bands I'll talk about. 6 gigahertz band, there's an open rulemaking on that. This would basically be an extension of the Uni 5 gigahertz band. 1200 megahertz from 5950 to 7150 is in play, and WISPA is looking to get 850 megahertz of that band authorized for higher power being what we're currently using in 5 gigahertz, subject to an automated frequency coordination, referred to as AFC, to protect the incumbent point-to-point operations that are in those bands. And a lot of WISPA members use those bands, so we're kind of uniquely positioned to both represent those that want to protect interference and ensure that that's done well as those that want to wedge in unlicensed operations around those point-to-point links. So we're very bullish on what the FCC may do there. I would think that end of this year, beginning of next year is when we may see rules on that. And finally, TV white space seems to have new life with the FCC, with Microsoft filing a petition for rulemaking to allow for higher power operations in uncongested areas, higher height above average terrain, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, because this is the TV white space band that propagates so well. and use of channels closer into TV channels. So there's some comments due in early June to see if asking whether the FCC should put this out for rulemaking. I think WISPA is going to support and say yes, the FCC should invite comment on Microsoft's proposal. So that's kind of, I guess one more band is the C-band. This is 3.7 to 4.2. Really interesting what's going on there with the satellite industry wanting to sell off as 200 megahertz or more and auction that off through a private auction approach, not an FCC auction, but they want to be able to do it themselves. A lot of questions as to whether they have the authority to do that or whether the FCC has authority to give them that authority. The rest, the Earth stations that are within that whole 500 megahertz would then get repacked into the top 300 megahertz, and WISPA is part of a broad coalition that wants to share that band to use for point-to-point, point-to-multipoint basis under a Part 101 frequency coordinated licensing regime. So think of the Earth stations as being protected in holes and us being able to use the cheese around it. So the Swiss cheese approach is what we're looking at in that top 300 megahertz, and a very contentious and interesting spectrum policy discussion ongoing on Capitol Hill and at the FCC. So that's kind of the spectrum rundown of everything that's going on right now at the FCC.
Would you say WISPA still has a good working relationship with the FCC and their commissioners?
Yeah, a good question, and the answer is yes. Much better since Claude is on board than just plain old me walking the halls at the FCC. So
Claude plays a good part in shepherding things through?
Absolutely. No question about it.
That's kind of his background, isn't it?
Yeah, that's where we first met, was when he was working at the FCC and the Wireline Bureau. So with his wireline background and me having done a lot of spectrum work over the last 12 years, we have a real good balance, and he's got great contacts, good intel, good insights, and we're a good team. I'm just happy. We should all feel fortunate that he is the pilot.
Good.
Yeah, he's been doing a great job. So.
All right, what was the third S?
The third S is, I guess, subsidy programs, but I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk a little bit about broadband mapping because that kind of plays into it. It just doesn't begin with an S. So anytime you hear a senator open his or her mouth when there's a hearing about broadband or the FCC, they start off by saying, broadband mapping sucks. And until recently, nobody's really had a good solution. So last year, WISPA and a couple of other associations got together and said, let's come up with a way to make this happen. And the folks over at US Telecom, sometimes our foes and sometimes not so much, and sometimes our friends, developed a kind of a program and, tried to sell everybody else on it. And WISPA quickly got on board along with a bunch of others to say, we like this proposal. And the proposal, I talk about it as being related to subsidies. It's related to Form 477, and the FCC is going through a Form 477 modernization proceeding right now. We also have Connect America Fund that's underway, and Connect America Fund recipients are under an obligation to serve certain number of, quote, locations over a period of time. Understand that Form 477 uses households or location. They don't really use locations. They use how many customers do you have within a census block. CAF is subject to locations. So the idea here is to kind of determine what are broadband serviceable locations everywhere in the country. So the broadband mapping process is getting underway through a pilot program. So if you are in Missouri or if you are in Virginia, you have the opportunity to participate in this pilot program. The cool thing is you're going to get a lot of great data from this that you can use for free to do spectrum planning and coverage planning and service rollout planning within your area, whether you're a CAF recipient or whether you're not. If you happen to live in those two states, you can be part of the pilot program, and I can put you in touch with the folks who are running that. So the first, it's kind of a 3-stage process, the way we've outlined this. So the first stage is every ISP, broadband provider, would submit into a secure portal address information, shapefile information, polygons, whatever you happen to have that defines where you provide service. Kind of the first step, and then you're pretty much done. The second step is the most interesting and has never really been done before, and that is that data gets overlaid on top of a multi-data set process. And the data sets are all out there with about 150 to 170 million data points in them for each one. So you're talking about 500 million data points, but all three of these are deficient. Let me talk about each one of them. First one is the building data set, a LiDAR-based approach like what Microsoft has used. Well, it's one thing to know where the buildings are. It's another thing to know what kind of building it is, because it may not be a serviceable location. And by that we mean kind of retail, residential, or small business. So is this building one that would be expected to buy retail broadband from an ISP? The second thing is there may be multiple locations within that building, an apartment building, a condo, something like that. What about a hospital? Well, it's a building, but it's not one where people live and would expect to buy broadband. So that's sort of, buildings only get you so far, but they get you pretty far. The next one is parcels. Every portion of the country has a parcel assigned to it. Well, some parcels don't have any buildings on them or locations on them. Some parcels may have multiple buildings on them or multiple serviceable locations on them. And some parcels you may have one location that straddles more than one parcel. So parcels get you pretty far down the road, but not all the way there. Third one is addresses. Everybody likes to say, well, addresses are great, until you go into a rural area and realize that the address is here and the actual location is a mile down the road. You also have P.O. boxes that are even further away. You have to go into town to find out where your mailbox is. And then you also have other issues with things like, so those are kind of the issues with addresses. So when you put all those three data sets on top of each other, you can get a much higher level of confidence because some of the deficiencies in each one is sort of superseded by the benefits of one of the other data sets. And then on top of that, you can add where it's available E911 information or tax record information. So, you have these other sort of one-off things that may be available in some areas but are not in others, like these first three nationwide data sets are. So you put all that together and you get a much higher level of confidence as to where serviceable locations are. This is referred to as the broadband location fabric, because the fabric, you weave together these three big data sets and sometimes other things. The last step would be kind of a crowdsourced, and this would be where you'd resolve basically conflict resolution. You go to three people and say, is that a location based on this criteria? And if all three of them say, yes, it is, then you say, all right, it's a location. But if there's some disagreement, you would escalate it, and maybe the provider can come back and say, hey, I've been to that area. I don't, there's nothing there, or that house burned down, or maybe there's a new development that came up overnight, and that's why, there's a partial building there that you can see on Google Earth. So this would be kind of a managed crowdsourcing process, and I'm actually pretty excited about it. The idea here is you take the pilot program, and if it proves the concept and gets us to a pretty high level of confidence, then, we ask the FCC to ask Congress for money to do this on a nationwide basis. So we encourage, this is my little sales plug, we encourage anybody in Virginia and anybody in Missouri who's an ISP to participate in the program. You can email me and I can put you in touch with the folks at CostQuest Associates. Many of you may be familiar with them because they do a lot of mapping and data analytics and cost modeling in the broadband industry here and overseas, and I can provide you with information as to how to participate. So against that backdrop, there are folks on Capitol Hill that are trying to advance some legislation. Some of it is sort of not quite what we're looking for. So we're hoping to get in there and try to improve that legislation. What we don't want to see is kind of a repeat of what we did in 2012, when every state had a mandate to go out and do something, and you ended up with some states using this methodology, some states using a different methodology, some states using no methodology, some states verifying, some states not. And it became kind of a patchwork, and some cared and some didn't. So it's a nationwide problem, and industry is interested in solving it in a way that is that takes advantage of these data sets, and without having every ISP being a member of the National Broadband Mapping Commission, because I don't think we want to be agents of the federal government. So this private process that CostQuest Associates has been really cool about would be awesome. The other cool thing about this is that we're trying to get the FCC in the Form 477 process to adopt sort of standardized propagation for submission of data into Form 477. So each band, 5 gigahertz, 2.5, 365, 900, 2.4, whatever it happens to be, would kind of have its own safe harbor to kind of rationalize and standardize what propagation would be. You can deviate from that, but the idea here is to build in something that doesn't sort of end up being, well, tell us what your road segments are. Well, road segments have nothing to do with fixed wireless. So let's kind of come up with a metric for fixed wireless, and we've given the information to the FCC on that. So that's it on broadband mapping, and maybe you guys got a couple of questions on that.
Steve?
No, I mean, it does seem pretty antiquated to fill out my 477s and just send it off. No real questions. I mean, the process seems a little bit more concise, especially, like you said, making a fabric of different data sets to get you a higher likelihood of accuracy.
Well, I mean, it really depends on what your goal is in my particular case. Obviously we run tower coverage, so we're kind of biased a little bit, but the shape files are extremely useful for the industry, and it literally can cut a census block in half. But if you cover any part of it with the Form 477, guess what? You cover that census block, or that's what you're saying with the Form 477. So I definitely think the standardization of propagation, which that becomes very, very difficult because there's 30 different methods of figuring out propagation, and then standardizing all that. Trust me, it can be done. It's just a matter of everybody consenting to, yes, this is good enough for us.
One standard.
Right. The cellular industry uses a lot of radios that can handle multipath. Most of our radios don't handle multipath very easily. So there's one propagation model that actually sits there and figures out multipath, and one propagation model that doesn't, etc. It definitely gets very, very difficult. But as long as we've given that information to the FCC, then it's really up to them to figure out what we actually need and what we actually have to do. So I'm very familiar with all those programs. Trust me, I'm more to it. I'm more interested in getting that data to the people and to the states that need it. I don't know if the number of households that need broadband, as you said, locations, I don't know if that's actually, quote, necessary, but if we're already using that standard, that may be what we have to do. So it is what it is in that particular instance.
Yep, and I think the propagation part is really important, and I know that tower coverage has been providing great service to a lot of members, and I think this would be a good opportunity for you guys to kind of participate in this program at the front end, and maybe even on the back end to help check the data. So business advice, not that you need it, but I think there's a lot of ways that you guys could support the effort, so appreciate that.
Yep.
Yeah, but I look at it like this too. Back in the day, the state I'm in, New Mexico, they want me to do all this work for them to do their job for free. And I'm all, you people aren't paying me, and I've got bigger things to do. I can't help you.
Yeah, and that's why this process it's basically just giving going into the portal and giving CostQuest your raw data, and they'll take care of the rest. So it's even less work than what you do for Form 477.
Right.
So,
like giving them your map location where all your towers are, and that's about it. It sounds like.
Yeah, well, and they have an NDA, so they will, they won't share that information except on an aggregated basis. So, folks should feel comfortable that there's some security and confidentiality associated with what you're giving them. So, again, and Dennis, I know you're close to a lot of the WISP there in Missouri, so. And I know you've been trying to encourage participation, so appreciate that and keep sending the word out.
Yep.
All right, small business.
So, small business, we're going to hear a lot about net neutrality and privacy in the months to come. I don't know whether we're going to have any actual legislation coming out of that. Just reading something here on CNN that says, Trump says he won't work with Democratic leaders until they, quote, get those phony investigations over with, close quote. So whether that means we won't have any legislation for the rest of the year, I don't have any idea. But, we'll, every day is kind of new here. But, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of, saber rattling as we've had for many years over coming up with net neutrality legislation. We're also expecting a decision from the Court of Appeals here in D.C. probably in the next 60 days or so, give or take, that will, rule on the Restoring Internet Freedom order that the PI-led FCC adopted last year, 2 years ago, whenever it was. I guess it was last year. And then privacy, we may see something move on that as well, but on the small business angle, that's something, WISPA has been, don't impose disproportionate burdens on small businesses. And that applies to obligations you may have under privacy rules or obligations you may have under net neutrality rules. So we're looking out for the small businesses, the small ISPs on those sorts of things. We didn't talk about subsidies, so I can talk about that. That's the other S. We kind of blew past that when we talked about broadband mapping, but we are expecting, May 31 is the deadline for folks to apply for 100% grant funding through the Rural Utility Service Reconnect program. So May 31, again, is that deadline for $200 million. There's a deadline in June for the combined grant loan program, and then in July, another $200 million for the straight loan. So if you're interested in the Reconnect program, please be sure to let me know. And we have a deck that we did at WISP America that we can push out to folks who are interested in that. But May 31 is coming up pretty fast. Told there's a lot of interest in getting access to some of that money. Be aware that these are for areas that are not covered by the Connect America Fund program. So recipients in the CAF program should be fairly certain that the money allocated for this pilot program is not going to be used to overbuild areas where they're receiving money. So that's where we are on that program.
There you go. Awesome.
So if they're interested in going after this money, and it's pretty the clock is ticking, how do they reach out to you to get the I mean, is that on the wispa.org website? Your presentation?
The best thing to do is just send me an email, whether it's about broadband mapping or whether it's about the Reconnect program or anything else, at scoran@lermancenter.com, LERMANSENTER.com. And we'll be happy to send some materials out to you and have you take a look at them.
There you go.
Great. Well, I don't have any more questions. I appreciate you coming on the show and giving us an update of what WISPA's doing for its members. It sounds like you and Claude are really tag teaming it and got a better handle on it now that we got an insider with the FCC working it with you. Yeah, and I'm sure with our lobbyist as well.
Yeah, and on that, in addition to our outside lobbyist, folks may have met Christina Mason, who's full-time inside government relations. We have a full-time communications director, Mike Wendy. So beefing up the staff here in D.C. to do more outreach, to do more media, and to touch more people on our issues on the Hill and at the FCC. So really happy and encouraged with the way things have moved under Claude's leadership in the last 13 months.
Yeah. Dennis, you got any questions?
No, I think we're really good. I think we've filled up our hour or so, and I hope that this information is very vital to all WISPA members as well as anybody that's listening. This is all really good information. It gives us a good update on what is going on, what is actually happening with both WISPA as well as with the FCC in all encompassing view. So I think it was a really great show. Thank you very much, Steve, to put it on and to come on.
Thank you. Appreciate doing it. And anytime you guys want to have me back, I'm happy to join.
Maybe in August or September, once the July meeting. You mentioned some things that are going to be going on at that July meeting. We could talk about that. But appreciate you being on the show. And with that, we'll wrap up the show. Thanks a lot, guys.
See you later. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to ISP Radio. We hope you've gained new insights and additional wisdom in our industry as well as your business. Please remember to visit our show sponsors via the links on ispradio.com. If you're interested in becoming a show sponsor, contact us at sales@ispradio.com. Now go out there and push those packets as fast as you can. Good luck and Godspeed.